St. Mark of Ephesus. 10 arguments against the existence of the purifying fire. 10 arguments demonstrating that there is no purifying fire. 1. Among those who behold the glory of God, one sees it more perfectly than another. Specifically, the one who is more purified sees it more perfectly. However, the concept of being more purified necessarily introduces the concept of being less purified, that is, in other words, being less capable of perceiving the vision of God. For if the greater corresponds to the greater, then, conversely, the lesser corresponds to the lesser. Yet even one who has committed certain minor sins will still see God without experiencing a purifying fire, for in place of such fire, he benefits from the all-sufficient loving kindness of God. As the great Dionysius, who speaks of divine matters, says, "To those who have lived piously according to their merits, the righteous judgments of God grant a reward for their radiant and divine life, while the defilements committed by them out of human weakness are forgiven by the goodness of divine loving kindness. For, as Scripture says, no one is pure from defilement." 2. Furthermore, if certain things are identical in relation to something else, then they must also be identical in relation to one another. That is, if A equals C and B equals C, then A equals B. If this is the case, then according to their operation, energy, they do not differ from one another due to their identity, and consequently, the result of their action will not be different but the same. The result of the action of purification, which consists in turning away from sin, turning towards virtue, and engaging in good deeds, determines the vision of God. But the pure is in no way different from the pure. If all those who, having hated sin, performed many good deeds, or, due to death preventing them, did not perform them, yet died with a good will, are purified in purgatory, then all of them, both the purified and the already pure, are in no way different from one another. Nor do they differ from those who departed from this life with both a good will and good deeds. For in the orientation of their will, they are identical, and the deficiency of deeds is compensated by passing through the purifying fire. Consequently, neither in terms of action, energy, nor in terms of the corresponding result do the blessed differ from one another. Since their action, which purifies them, is identical, the resulting outcome must also be identical. Thus, all will behold the glory of God equally. However, the Church teaches the opposite, declaring that in the prepared vision of God, there are many mansions, and from their order and degree, differences are made manifest. 3. Furthermore, in purified souls, the evil that necessitated the purifying fire is no longer observed, for purification must necessarily result in liberation from evil. But good and evil are opposed to one another, as deficiency is opposed to the fullness of form. In those things where no deficiency is observed, it necessarily follows that their form is perfect, for imperfection arises only due to deficiency. Thus, the purified soul will possess perfect goodness, which is understood as beatitude. However, if many perfected beings share the same form, they do not differ from one another in terms of goodness, but only numerically. And since the corresponding result, which is beatitude, is granted solely by virtue of purification, it follows that all the souls of the blessed partake in an identical vision of God, in which beatitude consists. But this is false. For the Lord himself declares in the Gospels that there are many mansions in the Father's house, and many saints, who are not to be doubted, have understood this as referring to a distinction in the blessed life. Thus, this is the reality of the matter. For, furthermore, turning away from sin is turning toward God and love for virtue, through which we ascend to him. If a rightly disposed will is accompanied by the practice of virtues, then nothing is lacking. But if the soul possesses an unwavering will, yet the practice of virtues is cut short by the sword of death, then the only difference between this soul and one that has both will and deeds is that the former falls behind in works, that is, in virtue. If therefore such a soul also attains blessedness without suffering, it is clear that it will not receive the same reward as perfected souls, and thus, the existence of different heavenly dwellings must be acknowledged. However, if, due to its deficiency, it endures punishment and passes through purgatory, and thereby eventually attains equality with the perfected soul, compensating through suffering what was lacking, then all will ultimately behold God in the same measure. But this is an absurdity, and must be rejected. 5. Furthermore, to attain blessedness, righteousness of will is required, which manifests in the soul's general good disposition, and good deeds, worthy of reward, must follow it. However, both the movement of the will and deeds are necessarily confined to this present life. This is also your own position, for you say that those in purgatory have an immovable will. But if the will is entirely immobile in any direction, then no one among them can be more worthy than another. Thus, even if souls are not purified by fire, they will not be any less worthy of the vision of God, since they died in a good disposition of soul, which is the primary requirement for blessedness. For if purgatory does not transform an evil will into a good one, and it is precisely the right disposition of will that is required for blessedness, then purgatory contributes nothing in this regard, and that which serves no purpose exists in vain, but God has created nothing in vain. Therefore, purgatory does not exist. 6. Furthermore, the justice of eternal punishment is based on the immutability of the sinful will in those who have sinned, for an eternally sinful will must correspond to eternal punishment. Conversely, the following must also hold. If one who remains eternally unchanging in evil suffers eternal torment, then one who does not suffer eternal torment must be assumed not to have an unchanging will. For if a person with an immutable will toward evil endures eternal punishment, then one whose will is immutable toward good, what need has he for punishment, when on the contrary he should receive crowns? Yet you claim that those purified by that purifying fire have an immutable will. Therefore, there is no need for them to be purified by that fire. 7. Furthermore, an immutable disposition toward goodness results in a state of sinlessness in a person. For if love for the good and an ardent desire for it are the causes of not wishing for evil, since when a person intensely loves one thing, he turns away from its opposite, and since evil is opposed to good and sinfulness to virtue, it follows that love for virtue expels sinfulness. As it is written, I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my heart. Psalm 31 verse 5. And again, declare your transgressions first, that you may be justified. Isaiah 43 verse 26. But you Latins say that the will of those in purgatory is unchangeable and entirely good. Thus, it turns out that the sinless are suffering and unjustly enduring punishment. 8. Furthermore, the will is capable of changing toward evil only as long as the soul is united with the body. But once it is separated from the body, it will remain fixed in the state it desired, and according to this disposition, it will receive either reward or punishment, without passing through purgatory. 9. Furthermore, it is more in keeping with the goodness of God to not overlook even a small good than to consider a small sin worthy of punishment. However, the small good in those who have committed great sins does not receive a reward because of the dominance of evil. Likewise, a small evil in those who have been righteous in great deeds does not bring punishment, since the greater good prevails. For if the greater part does not exist, then naturally, neither does the lesser. Therefore, one should not believe in purgatorial fire. 10. Finally, just as there is a small good in those who are otherwise evil, so too there is a small evil in those who are otherwise good. But the small good in the wicked cannot lead to the reward given for virtuous deeds. It can only create a distinction in the severity of punishment. Likewise, a small evil does not lead to punishment, but merely creates a distinction in the degree of blessedness. Therefore, one should not believe in purgatorial fire.